Hello and welcome to our office webinar series and the session today on the perspective of the Chief Human Resources Officer, or the CHRO, on diversity, equity, and inclusion. To be clear, the conversation is for anyone, regardless of your specific title. If you are or aspire to be an HR leader or any other stakeholder who interacts with or is impacted by human resources in your organization, this session is for you. So that's pretty much everybody. As we often talk about in this webinar series, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts have become really mainstream these days and are more ingrained in organizations of all sizes and types. So we thought it was very timely to talk to a CHRO who not only has had incredible experience as an HR executive across several major organizations, but is sought after for his ability to think both strategically and tactically, and to clearly articulate the trends, opportunities, and risks, as well as tactics and actions. I'm Sonia Sapaban, CEO of our office, where we help organizations of all kinds build an inclusive workplace by providing the 3 Ps, what we call the 3 Ps, which is the process, the platform, and the professional expertise, all at an affordable annual subscription. I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Bosch, who has been an HR executive at companies like DirecTV, Pizza Hut, and Mattel. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Sonia. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We also have Anushka Sarif, one of my colleagues at our office, who will be moderating the questions in real time. She'll also be chiming in as needed. Thanks in advance, Anushka. So before we get started, let's make sure you're familiar with what you will see on the slides. There's just a few, and with the webinar tool. This is an interactive webinar. There will be polls throughout the session. We ask you to participate to enrich really this conversation for yourself and everyone who's tuning in. You can also use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions or provide your inputs or perspectives on the discussion. We will answer as many questions as possible in real time and later as well if we don't get to all of them. Lastly, please note that this session is being recorded and will be available after the webinar on our event page. And that is ouroffice.io/events. Okay, so here's the agenda. We'll start by talking about what CHROs are most worried about right now. There's certainly a lot to talk about there. And then we'll talk about the role of DEI in dealing with the emerging priorities in this new normal. How does diversity, equity, and inclusion really relate to that? And last, as we always like to do, we'll ask Joe to share some practical advice for HR leaders and how to be a strategic advisor to their CEOs in these challenging times. But before we start, let's learn more about Joe. Joe, can you share a bit about your background and what you're doing these days, please?
Sure. Thanks, Sonia. Well, as you mentioned in the beginning, the majority of my career I spent in corporate America in large organizations like PepsiCo, Pizza Hut. My most recent full-time job was with DirecTV as the Chief Human Resource Officer. And back in 2017, I did a stint with Mattel as an interim CHRO. But since leaving DirecTV, largely I've been doing executive coaching and consulting. I've been coaching a number of current Chief Human Resource Officers and consulting on business and HR strategies.
Great. Thanks for that, Joe. We're lucky to have you here today with us. Now, remember I said earlier, this is an interactive webinar where we can have a two-way conversation through the chats and the polls. So let's start with the first poll to learn more about you, everyone who is tuned in. Please select the option that you'll see here that corresponds to your current or most recent role. So the options are you're a CHRO or HR leader. Perhaps you are a DEI leader. You're actually focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you're a CEO, please select that option. Other C-suite executives, and then any other roles, please. And we'll give it a minute because it takes a bit of time for for these to come up usually by the time that it starts registering. All right, so you can see on the screen how the numbers are changing as people vote here. And so we do have CHROs, or HRDs looks like about a 40% or so, about maybe 15, 20% DEI leaders, close to 10%, other C-suite executives, and then about a third in other roles. All right, give it another 5 seconds here and see if anybody has been just taking their time to maybe enter. That's awesome. Yeah, it's getting to about 40%, 20%, so a total about 60% in a leadership role in human resources and or DEI, and then about a third in other key roles. And again, this is really applicable for everyone, so we're glad to have you all here with us. So we're going to talk about what keeps CHROs up at night with everything that's going on. So, Joe, before we start that conversation, I'm curious, even before COVID and remote work and all the political and social events of 2020 and 2021, what used to keep you up at night before? And then we can talk about now a little bit later.
Yeah. Well, I think for most chief human resource officers, job one is talent. So, I think they worry most about making sure they have the right people kind of at the right time in the right places, the right skill levels and right leadership. That's kind of job one, I think, of a CHRO. And probably job two is making sure you're developing your culture in a way that actually creates a competitive advantage that's inclusive of everyone and kind of leverages all the talent in the organization. So, I say those two things are always top of mind, talent and culture, at least for me.
It's interesting that you mentioned culture even before, right? That you were focused on that. And I think that was a trend. When do you think that trend started? I'm reflecting 20 plus years before, and I know there was changes through my career. When did you start really seeing that?
I think it's, culture and change management and all those areas, probably for the last 10, 12 years have become quite a big focus. I mean, organizations have learned that if they can, in fact, create an environment where people come every day and can bring, 100% of their skills, their abilities, their energy, that's an environment that can win in the marketplace. And I think what you see, and I see this across private equity as well as public companies, private companies, people are realizing that, that old axiom that, your human talent is the most critical asset. Well, I think you've seen the last probably 10 years, people actually put real energy, real measurement, real, resources against building that environment. And I think it's only going to, I think obviously COVID, drove home the fact that having a winning culture is key to success in any kind of crisis.
Yeah, which brings us to the next topic. What's interesting to me is that it used to be CEOs and CFOs who would find themselves mostly front and center when it came to breaking the news to employees, shareholders, and other key stakeholders. These days, it's often the CHRO accompanying the CEO and advising them on key decisions that are bound to impact the company's performance and branding for many years to come. And they're often quite visible in those roles. So with that backdrop, what are CHROs most worried about now in light of return to work, especially as we're looking forward to that more broadly? And just, this past year, all of the events and all of what is yet to come, probably.
I think it's a great question. First, I can say I'm very pleased that I am not in an active sitting CHRO role through this pandemic. I have huge empathy for all the active human resource leaders and diversity and inclusion leaders. It's just, I'm glad I'm not working full time, I have to say, because it's just the amount of things you have to consider or be considering simultaneously is just grown by magnitudes. Obviously, employee safety has taken on a whole new level of focus for most leaders. and how you define safety and what you do around your workforce to protect your employees has changed dramatically for pretty much everybody. I think the other, in some ways, COVID's been a great level setter or equalizer in terms of, people being aware of all the challenges that go on in terms of working. And it's brought a lot of leaders new insights. But I think, one of the things I'm seeing right away is that how are you going to maintain a culture or the kind of, culture you'd like to have in your company in a hybrid work situation? And, I think one of the things about COVID that is brought to light is that really, from what I can see and read, is probably only about 30% of all jobs can be done remotely on a consistent basis. And so for a lot of industries outside of, let's say, tech or more kind of white collar oriented type work, you're going to have this hybrid workforce. And so how do you maintain connectivity, two-way communication, leadership presence with this growing kind of divided workforce? It's just going to be a huge challenge thinking through that. And then just as you keep going down the path, we can see already this year, talent acquisition is becoming incredibly difficult. Almost every employer, especially in the industries that were hit very hard, like restaurants and, hotel and hospitality, they can't find employees right now. So I think you've got everything kind of just magnified this year, coming out of COVID, as we hopefully get back to some form of closer to what we considered normal.
And so in light of these challenges, I know that you have, of course, you're in the community of CHROs, you're very connected and respected. Who do you see really thriving in terms of, CHROs that are doing well in this environment?
Well, Sonia, it's interesting. I would say from my observation first, the companies that are doing the best and seem to be moving beyond just the safety issues and the workforce policies and are moving to much more proactive communication and steps. First, these companies seem to have very clear core values, and they quickly went back to those core values through the pandemic, and they're continuing to use those core values as kind of their grounding mechanism and their framework for how they make decisions. I think the second thing is the leadership, and not just the CEO and not just the CHRO, but the senior leadership is very present and very active in both communications and visibility where they can do that, physically be present with employees. I think those two things seem to distinguish. The third point I'd say is, this kind of maybe goes back to leadership and the values, but the companies that seem to be doing the best too are very authentic about when they don't know what to do. They admit they don't necessarily know exactly what to do sometimes. These are new things, and they do an excellent job of finding out what employees think and what the workforce is feeling. And so they have this ability to tap into the organization on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of, having values and having vision and mission, all of these things, we all did for many years, throughout our careers. But I think sometimes we just looked at it as an exercise. Everybody has to have one, right? But now I see it also in the boardroom, throughout my last, 15, 20 years of career, and then now sitting on a public company boards and so on. I see how that makes a big difference. And one of the things that has really, for me, also come up is, used to be when we had issues, things didn't move as fast, it didn't change as often. And we could go, hire a consultant, and help us, through that, or go and find an expert and hire them. Now it seems like as you are looking at your leadership team, and again, both from the executive management side, but also from the board side, it seems to me that you just have to have the right diverse team on board already to be ready to tackle all of these challenges in real time. Used to be that we would have, board training or executive management, offsites and things like that, which are still, of course, very important to do, but they're just not enough. It's like you need to have more ready, like all hands on deck, have the right complement of different kinds of people and backgrounds and perspectives to deal with these on a moment's notice as things change and new challenges present themselves almost on a monthly or weekly basis.
I think you're absolutely right. I also think you see boards getting much more involved in kind of, I'll say, emergency communications or having a plan around crisis communication. And I see boards asking very different questions than they did a year ago about the company's leadership and are they able to respond to the next crisis? Because I think if you jump back to last summer with Black Lives Matter, you saw a lot of CEOs make pretty strong statements, and without little thought, but without thoughts about how you're going to actually execute against those statements or bring those company commitments to life. And I think boards have gotten very sensitive about that, and rightly so, and forcing leadership to think more thoroughly about how they're going to respond to crisis and how they're going to build sustainable responses.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We will have a conversation just about board perspective in month of June, actually, with again someone that we'll talk about at the end a little bit about our upcoming webinars with really key people that can shed light from different perspectives. But I think it is interesting that just a last point on the board perspective is that the governance, the meaning of governance, it used to be that you want to be kind of hands off with executive management. And I think largely, obviously, still that's true. You don't want the board running the company, but there's a lot more, I think, engagement. And I think boards are asking a lot more questions. We have customers that have come to us who are very much, looking for some support because the board asked them a question. Or they had a very specific, board imperative or some kind of an objective that was handed down to them. So they actually tell us that, the board is asking these questions and how can we answer it? So with that, let us actually, this is a good entree, I think, to go a little bit towards talking specifically about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it can help with some of these emerging priorities. But let's first take a moment and talk about the changing definition of DEI itself. Can you share your thoughts on what HR leaders need to think about when they consider, an employee backgrounds and experiences, how that definition has really changed or what they consider to be diverse in terms of that, in terms of the attributes or the backgrounds and experiences of employees?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, in the traditional often definition of diversity, which kind of fall on maybe race and gender and ethnic backgrounds, I think with COVID, it opened the door quite a bit when I think about the differences between just simple things like access to technology, or we spent a lot of time talking about just Wi-Fi and quality Wi-Fi to be able to do your work remotely. I think I read recently something like 70% of workers in America don't have access to a company email address because they don't sit at a desk. Yeah. And so childcare is another great example. I mean, for a lot of leaders, COVID was good in the sense that a lot of leaders all of a sudden realized the challenges that working mothers have in terms of balancing childcare and work. And it was kind of because you got to see right into people's homes, at least on the remote work side. So I think the definition has gotten pretty big. And I also think it pushes you much more to thinking about inclusion. And I can't probably address everyone's individual need, but how do I create an environment where inclusion is the core of our culture and making it easy for people to participate? So I think it's gotten to be a much bigger definition and, quite frankly, a much more complex definition.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. When it comes to women, especially, I mean, they are leaving the workplace, at a much, much higher rate than men. It is very unfortunate that a lot of the gains that have been made before, I mean, I see it in our work where women are so busy and end up having the primary responsibilities a lot of times for kids and for family care. And so it's a time when we have to be very careful about that. And I know as we come out of this, hopefully in the near future, now that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, the problem is with organizations that are not proactive. It'll be hard to make up for it, at the time when we start coming out of this. So time is, I mean, there's an urgency that I'm not sure everybody is yet feeling about this particular issue of maintaining and improving the diversity and equity and inclusion of their workplace. So with that, let us first, before we talk about this more, if you agree, let's find out about the ranking of diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations today. So we have a poll that Anushka will put up here in a moment, and the options here are in terms of how do you rank the priority of DEI in your organization today. It can be, you can rank it as top priority, somewhat of a priority, not a priority, or that you don't know. So please take a moment and let's see what our poll will say here. Okay, it's coming in. It's around close to 60-40 between top priority and somewhat of a priority. There's no one that says it's not a priority. Oh, sorry, I just said that and it's jumped to maybe 6% here. We have about 65%, close to 2/3, say that it's a top priority. It is now over 2/3, 68%. Somewhat of a priority, about 26%, and about 5% or 4% now, not a priority. It's nice to see that over 70% now with our responses here are saying that DEI is ranked as a top priority. Wow, that's awesome. So with that information, Joe, let's talk about this a little bit more. In the past, DEI was yet another thing to do. I read in an HBR piece late last year that organizations are increasingly talking about meeting employees where they are through an inclusive mindset. So what are your thoughts on what that means? And, can we just kind of like unpack a little bit what this idea, I mean, even though we see that DEI is a priority and is very mainstream, how does it really stack? It's a priority, right? How does it stack with other priorities? Has it really become integrated into how companies think about their priorities and their strategies, and not just yet another thing to do, kind of separate from the rest of the strategy and operational imperatives that organizations have?
I think, first off, I think the results of the survey you just did are consistent with some of the things I've been reading and seeing, is that many CHROs have moved beyond the hybrid workforce and return to work. They're testing policies and practices, and they're moving beyond that. And the reason DE&I is so high on the list, I think, is because what COVID did is highlighted the changing expectations for workforces of what they expect their company to do for them and with them. So, for example, obviously on the healthcare front, COVID exposed the, great inequities of people that had insurance, didn't have insurance, those kinds of things. On income protection, that got highlighted. Companies are under huge pressure to add certain kinds of benefits, for example, around mental health that were hardly ever discussed before. But on the diversity front, I look at the external social pressures that were highlighted this summer with the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter protests, and even you see all the rating agencies and the NASDAQ and the S&P, they're putting in demands that companies report on their environmental, societal, and governance. So I think you're seeing a convergence of, you need to step up to the plate if you're an organization. And if you're going to tackle these issues and challenges, first off, you're going to have to report on them. Second, you have to make progress against them. So I think you're seeing kind of everything aligning in many ways. And I think that's why it's becoming such a heavy priority for organizations. They're realizing, look, this is a challenge, an issue, but there's also solutions here. And oh, by the way, those solutions add value to everybody. So I think you're seeing a lot of convergence there. Second, I think with the pressure on talent, I think most good companies are realizing they can't afford to lose their talent, and it's getting harder and harder to attract great talent. And so if you have a culture that's not inclusive and not inviting to everyone, you're just missing the boat in terms of your growth potential and your ability to compete.
What do you say, Joe, to companies, organizations that say, well, we're in compliance, we are doing everything, we have an affirmative action plan, we file our EO1 reports, as needed, or that say, we're too small, we're too young, we're too small. What do you say to them?
What do I say in my head, or what do I say?
Well, both.
I think what I'd say is, look, and I ran all of Pepsi's diversity programs back in 1991. And
wow.
What I've learned in 30 years is that you cannot recruit your way to success in this area if you aren't pulling all the levers. Mm. You can never hire enough people to change your diversity mix if you don't have other things working. For example, how you develop talent, the kind of culture you have that makes it easy for people to fit in and succeed. So to me, it's a lot like how change management has evolved over the last 20 years. It's become quite a science, and organizations have learned that you've got to have a strategic approach which pulls a number of levers simultaneously, and you've got to be willing to measure these initiatives much like you'd measure any business initiative, with hard data and goals and objectives, and maybe hard assessment of why you're not meeting those goals. So I think it's, like any business challenge, it's got to be a comprehensive approach or it just doesn't stick.
This is very consistent with my experience. I often tell the story of when, in 2009, 2010 timeframe is when my own journey into diversity, equity, and inclusion started. Even though I was an engineer, a woman engineer, male-dominated industries, that really wasn't on my radar as a major focus. I was focused on my career. And along the way, as challenges came up, you just deal with them, But organizationally, in that time frame, I was at a major corporation, a great organization, and we were trying to become more diverse and inclusive and equitable, born out of a strategy of innovation. And we were trying to change the brand of the company to a more innovative brand and to do things, be more agile. And so it was clear that drawing on different experiences was very important. So I really love what you said about you can't recruit your way out of this, because that's exactly what we did. And of course, it's necessary to do, to go out and reach and hire more diverse people. We did a fairly good job of that. And then we had some initiatives and things going on, directing towards inclusion. But the lesson I learned about 6.5, 7 years later, in terms of the level of results that we got compared to the amount of effort we put in, it was very consistent with some data that BCG has put out that, even though majority of organizations now are having some activity and initiatives and effort and resources being spent on it, that 75% of the people that are supposed, the intended target audience of these efforts that should benefit from it say that they don't benefit.
Yeah.
So 75%. I mean, that's a huge, in anything else, if we try to be more safe or more quality, high quality organization and we only got 25% benefit, that would be a big failure. So, and what's even worse in my own experience is after we did that and we didn't quite reach the goals and things that we had set out to do, after I left the organization, about a year or two out, things had unraveled. A lot of what we had put in place, and people were calling me, and it wasn't because anyone was trying to unravel them. But again, it's to your point, because we had failed to connect, to link with the business priorities, with the strategic drivers, and to make that real, and then do it throughout the organization as an integral part of the organization. We did not have the sustainability, the results, or the sustainability of the effort. So it was quite, I will tell you that is what informed us to start what we did, that we started to, this effort that we have, which with our customers, that's where we start. I mean, the first weeks, all we do is talk about what is your business about? What are your priorities? What is your what are your strategic levers that you've established? And let's see if there's a linkage with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there always is, one way or another. It may not be apparent. And we start there. The tools and the data, and like you said, that we have like 50 key performance indicators of diversity, equity, and inclusion. These things, they come after. They come after you've established that critical linkage, and you have really aligned all of the leadership and engaged all of the employees in understanding those and relating to them. One of the things I like to do when I talk to the best-in-class organizations that we're fortunate to talk to a lot of times is, whether it's a business leader or, someone that's a key stakeholder, I ask them, what are your DEI objectives? I mean, what are the specific ones? And I'm always surprised how many can't just recite them off the top of your head. Like these are the three things, right, that we're trying to get done this year. And then what astounds me is they don't even know where to go to look for it. Like, where would I find where my DEI objectives are for the year? So when you don't have that alignment, it's no wonder that you don't get the kind of results that you want and the kind of sustainable focus on it.
Sonia, one thing just to build off of build off of your point was, I do think when I say you can't recruit your way out of this, one thing I'm positively excited about is the pressure on boards for diversity on the boards and at the senior level of companies, because we all know there's power structures in companies. And when you get women or people of color on a board, the tenure of the discussion changes, the perspectives change. And I do think in any, if you're serious about changing diversity and inclusion in your company, you can't ignore the power structure. And I've seen it over and over where all of a sudden you get a new chief operating officer that happens to be a woman. All of a sudden things change. And so I do think, just having diverse people alone isn't enough. At certain levels of the organization, I think if you want to drive real change, you've got to advocate for that, because that does change the tenor of the discussion and the focus on outcomes and the focus on business, attacking this as a business issue. I think it makes a big difference.
I'll take a moment and actually you triggered another thought, Joe, which is I hear once in a while, not very often, once in a while I hear, we don't need someone focused on or a consultant or any help, or it's throughout our organization. It's what we all do. So therefore, we don't want to isolate it and say, here's a person or here's an effort focused on it. But then, I always ask, well, what about safety and quality? I mean, safety and quality are things that are everyone's job, and everybody, all companies or organizations aspire to those things. But don't you have some effort, some focus, some requirements, some, people focused on it? I mean, just saying, I know that people say these things with best intentions, but as people that are day in and day out dealing with this out there and seeing who's successful and who's not, it's really, I really hope that people take it to heart, that if there's one thing that comes out of this conversation and sticks with people, you must really be intentional about this. It doesn't just happen because, we're all inclusive, yes, but you really know, we've talked to the most inclusive organizations where when we do some listening sessions, someone, in one of these sessions says, well, I don't feel included. And the organization as a whole is, but there's always, someone, and we ask them why, and they say, well, I'm an Asian American, and with everything that's been going on, I'm feeling real stressed and this and that, but I just don't feel comfortable to bring it up to anyone. Well, that tells you right there that there's an issue. And again, it's not to say that you can be 100%, but you want to at least have that on your radar. And when we share that in some way, or it comes out as a focus that the organization should focus on, it always surprises the leadership. And they go, oh, we just didn't know. And thank God that we know now, so we can do something about it. So I think being intentional and really focusing on these things is critically important. It doesn't happen on itself.
Agreed.
So let's talk a little bit about, now we've talked about this, what are some examples of where you've seen people do it right? I mean, is there any emerging ones? I mean, if you don't want to mention names, just some examples. We always like to make this a little bit real for people too, is, who is doing it right, or what are they specifically doing to do it right? A little bit more. We always like to be very action oriented in these conversations.
Yeah, so I think maybe in general, the companies I see doing it right are definitely taking a multi kind of level approach. And, the underlying part of their strategy is they're trying to make DE&I not a separate activity, but part of the core activities of the company. So it's not I have to do this plus DE&I. And so they're weaving it through, whether it's their performance management systems or their selection criteria or their human resource systems. Second, they're investing in education, either formal education and or I'll say more anecdotal education, where they're exposing their senior leadership to either outside industry thinkers or experts in the area who can help them frame the discussion in a way that they might not be, exposed to, nor, in a typical situation. And I think the other thing that they're doing is they're willing to set goals and be public about it, or be clear about their objectives. I just recently read McDonald's, what they put out, McDonald's Corporation, and the smartest thing I could see that they did is they set their goals around representation for women and people of color, but they set it out 4 or 5 years out. So you have to, one, show steady progress, and you have to maintain that progress or you won't make those goals. But they also set it out far enough to be reasonable that this is hard work. You can't just, go year to year. But they made it part of their compensation for their senior executives, so they're serious about it. So I think you have to, the ones I see are pulling multiple triggers simultaneously, and it's an integrated approach. It's not we're going to, just do better on recruiting college graduates, because we know the probability of them getting all the way through the corporate ladder is slim. So they're taking a multi-faceted approach, and they're integrated. They're communicating about it, and they're reporting on it. They're kind of measuring it. So I think that would be the general thing I see, the ones making the most progress.
Yeah, and what I want to add to that, I totally agree with it, is that what we advise organizations is, try and just get a start, right? Not everybody can do it all. We recognize that, right? We try and meet everyone where they are, right? And so what we advise is don't set lofty goals that you are not necessarily going to be able to meet, or just have an approach of, oh, we're going to have a 6-month effort, or, you know, hire somebody to come help us, and then we'll do some good things and that'll be that. It's not, it's a journey. You have to really think of it as a long-term journey. The reason is it can really backfire, or be ineffective as a minimum, but it can also backfire when you said something. It's like the statements you said. I mean, they were all done with good intention. I think everybody put out statements because they, at the time, you know, they wanted to be supportive and make a statement. But what's important, what we always say is, let's link it to your strategy and link it to everything that you're doing. But B, let's have consistency. You need approaches that you can actually continue. It's better to have a lower level effort, but plan it out for, you know, certainly the next year and beyond, something that you could continue to do, than have a very focused effort, have a bunch of, you know, maybe training and sessions and all hands, and hire somebody for 6 months to help you. And then after that, it fizzles out, because the approach is so important. When employees see that, a lot of times the early feedback that we see is employees are wondering if that's just the flavor of the month, or it's just, you know, because of the times, and they see through that. You know, people are smart.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
But if somebody, you know, if an organization says, hey, we may not have done anything focused on this, we're just starting, and this is what we're going to do. It may not seem like a lot, but we're going to continue and build on it. Surprisingly, that gets really good feedback, is what I've seen in recent times, especially with smaller organizations and ones that just maybe larger, but just haven't done anything. I want to just start to do something. We always caution them about this, to try and start slow, but keep at it.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, though, to me, is kind of authentic communication, because this is a very complex and challenging issue. We see it, it's, you know, society. It's not just within a company, it's kind of the whole society. So leaders that are able to communicate honestly and recognize when they don't know exactly what to do or how it's going to work, but they're open to learning and listening and adjusting as you go, I mean, I think gives people a lot of hope, and it gives them a lot of credibility, because it's a very challenging business issue.
Absolutely. You know, one other interesting thing is today is Earth Day, right? And so we have actually a good question here. I want to, as we're monitoring the chat, and please everyone, please keep putting your ideas and questions and perspectives and comments on the chat. But the question is around, you know, the connection between DEI and environmental issues and what, you know, today, I mean, today is also the day, of course, that the administration is having a virtual summit on this subject. So it's very timely. Certainly environmental and DEI have been lumped together under ESG and corporate responsibility and so on. How do you see that linkage, and what should organizations and their leaders maybe be aware of in that respect?
Well, I think the simple fact is that employees today, and especially this next generation, Millennials and Gen Z, they expect their company to be socially responsible. And if you're not, you're going to lose your brands. I mean, you can just see it's been a multi-year trend, but it's become very prevalent that if your organization is not prepared to respond to the outside world, you can no longer insulate yourself from the outside world. You're going to be at a deficit. So, you know, I just think it's obvious. It's a smart business strategy to have a point of view. You even see that today with voter rights. I mean, look at all the companies in Georgia who have spoken out. Typically, companies are very conservative, won't speak out on political issues unless they have to. But it's clear they know they have to. If they want to be competitive in the labor market and if they want to be competitive with consumers. So I think it's a good trend, and it's a growing trend. And that's why I go back to companies need to be very clear about their values, because they can't address every social issue but if they're clear about their values and their values reflect the kind of organization they want to be and the kind of society we want to live in, they'll have something to talk about, and they won't make, proclamations they can't live up to.
Yeah, so true. And the concept that's interesting is a lot of times, you can't, as you said, you can't react to everything, right? But sometimes, leaders might be wondering if this is just going to pass, or is it just a fad, or is it really an inflection point? And some topics that are here to stay, front and center. I think all you need to do is look at the profile of the workforce as you look ahead. And you can see that by 2025, it's projected that 75% of the workforce will be millennials and Gen Z. And so when we talk about millennials and Gen Z are, very focused on these issues, these kind of issues of DEI, for example, is one of the top 3 priorities, as they, for about 85 to 90% of millennials and Gen Zers, regardless of, woman or man. I mean, this includes the majority white male, for example, in the US, of the millennials and Gen Z. So that's a real issue, as you said, with relating to the talent acquisition and recruitment challenges that are occurring now, and certainly here to stay. So with that, I would say when a CEO, when you've talked to and advised many CEOs and many boards, and you've been a strategic advisor, I know this well. So how do you communicate with CEOs as they're trying to define their priorities? I know when I was in the seat, and kind of as a GM and running things, when every one of my direct reports that came in the room, within the first 15 seconds, I was looking to see how they would connect things with our priorities, and there were some that were more strategic and some that not so much. So how do you, as a CHRO, how do you communicate and kind of get that seat at the table to be a strategic advisor to the CEO?
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, because this, DE&I is probably one of the most emotional / kind of tension-filled challenges companies face. And, let's face it, today, I think 90% of CEOs, are white males. So they don't have the same experience of either women in the workplace or people of color or recent immigrants. But I think first, as an HR professional, my goal was always to make sure that the CEO believed that I had his or her best interests at heart, that I was committed to their success, not just to the success of the company, but their personal success, and that any feedback or advice I was giving them was in that context, their success as a leader and the success of the organization, because I always felt like, obviously they go hand in hand, but so you had to have that comfort level and that trust if you could build that trust up with the CEO. Second, I found that you could talk all the strategy you want, but CEOs also want to know, what are they supposed to do personally? Like, what am I supposed to do in my leadership style or what I choose to speak about? So I think I always found I had to address both the overall company strategy and also specifically what do I want you to do, or what would be helpful for you to do to move this forward. And then I think the third, it's hard to be a strategic advisor if you're not operating from data and facts, because CEOs respond to business issues that they can quantify and get their arms around and understand. And this is just one of those business issues. If you aren't coming with facts, data, it's very hard to, I think, be influential. So I'd say those 3 things would be, how I tried to approach most issues, especially when it came to kind of cultural or company issues in an organization.
And that's great advice. We have a good question from someone in our audience here that says, but let's say a CEO says, we want to change culture, they're cognizant of that. How would you advise them or the organization on how to change culture? And it's like a big thing, right? Are there any Just a couple of quick tips on that.
Yeah, I think first you have to do what we call sober selling. I mean, changing culture is one of the most difficult things you can tackle. And managing expectations of what it's going to be required if you're really serious about fundamentally changing the culture, the resources it's going to require, the leadership equity that it's going to require, and the risk that associated with that, because we know that 70% of major change initiatives fail. So the probability is small if you're going to jump off and tackle that to be successful. So you have to go in with your eyes wide open. Second, I think you got to be really clear about what about the culture do you want to change? Because many organizations are very successful, and part of their success is their culture. So is it a fundamental shift, 180-degree shift, or is it a pivot around certain things within the culture? And I think you got to be very clear about that, because you'll lose people very quickly if you try to change things that have made a company successful without any context for it. So I think those would be the two things I would say you kind of have to zero in on. And the last one is just recognizing you can't do this alone.
Yeah.
You cannot do this alone. This is an entire organization. It's a big organizational effort. It's not one. It's not the CHRO and the CEO. It's not just the executive leadership team. It's every level of leadership management, all the way through all employees.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're trying to change culture, I always go back to what's the definition of culture, right? It's just a set of behaviors of a group of people. So unless you can broadly engage and really motivate everyone to focus on this, it'll be hard to do. I love the sober selling terminology that you use there. And in some organizations it's easier than others. As you said, recruitment is a big thing to create that urgency and create that linkage. But we have a good question here about jobs like construction, like operators, fast food workers. So how do you make the argument within these groups of occupations? When you talk about DEI and how important it is, they're not maybe as skilled jobs, but very important jobs, and certainly essential workers. A lot of them fall in this category.
If I understand the question is how do you make DEI important in organizations that have, I would say, more of a manual workforce, labor force, or maybe proximity-based workforce like restaurants. I think in some ways the issue is even easier to make, because if you look at the populations of those kinds of businesses, they tend to be more diverse. And so to me, the argument becomes, is the leadership that in that workforce representative of the workforce, and even if they're not completely representative, are they aware enough and educated enough to effectively leverage that workforce and promote that workforce and develop that workforce? So I think I found in the restaurant industry, as an example, incredibly diverse, way more diverse than, pizza was way more diverse than Pepsi up and down the organization, just because of where we drew our employees from. So in some ways the arguments are easier. But again, you go back to, you've got to be hitting on all cylinders. You've got to be, leadership's got to have it right. You have to have the right culture. You have to have the right initiatives underneath that to support that. Otherwise, I think you're just, it's a little bit hit and miss.
Yeah, no, I think that you're exactly right. And, whereas in some knowledge industries, like tech, acquisition of talent may be a huge thing. I think in these kind of groups of, there's some other industries where they may be easily able to access talent, people that need jobs and they're not as skilled and they're always there, but the turnover is very high. I think the cost of turnover itself is, I found in my various experiences across industries is a big factor to think about. So there's always, and that's what I mean, there's always, just because you're not aware of it doesn't mean that linkage doesn't exist. So it's really worth exploring, what your priorities are, kind of getting alignment on that, and then looking at the DI angle of that. Well, I want to thank you so much, Joe. We have a few minutes left, and in the last 5 minutes or so, before we go to the Q&A, we'll have a short Q&A here. We'll see if we have time for it. But I do want to please encourage everyone to put their questions there. We have answered a couple of them thus far, and I do want to just take a moment and talk about some other things that we do in addition to our webinar series, which you see on our events page that are, might be of interest to everyone here. We're all about, bringing value and helping the community as best as we can. There's some reports that we have been, our office has been featured in, but they're good resources in general for, looking at the landscape of D&I, and if you're trying to do something, what tools and resources there are. There's a report by Deloitte and Mercer and Red Hat Research, for example. And you can also see some other activities we have, like our blogs, our roundtables that are really thought leadership opportunities for HR and DEI experts to join us there. We have ebooks and much more. You can always go to our website at ouroffice.io to see and join any of them, or just reach out to us by emailing us at webinar@ouroffice.io. And I also want to mention our upcoming webinars here. On May 20th, I'm delighted to talk with Andy Hove, CEO of AM General. In full disclosure, they have been for years a customer with us. But Andy has been doing an amazing job in this regard, managing many priorities, but always having DEI front and center. And so we'll talk with him about the CEO perspective on DEI and what he has done and how he sees the whole industry, and even more broadly, because they are a major global company. They're the legendary builders of the Humvee, which is called the workhorse of the military. They've been around for over a century, so it'll be really interesting to get his perspectives. I'm also very delighted and excited to talk with Hope Tate, the CEO of Eli Capital, who's been in the financial markets and a key player, very influential in that respect, and as a board member also across many companies, to talk about the board perspective on DEI. That'll be in June, and the specific date will be announced soon. So please mark your calendars with these upcoming exciting events. And with that, I think we have just about 3 minutes to talk about any questions that may still be out there or anything else. Let me first ask you, Joe, if you want to add anything. And then again, if your questions weren't answered, please feel free to write us at webinar@ouroffice.io that you see here on the screen, and we will definitely answer them afterwards. We get a lot of that afterwards, so please don't be shy. We're here to help and engage with you. And any other last words from you?
No, I would say is I think we just have to recognize this is a journey, and it's not an easy challenge, but it's a challenge that can definitely be addressed and overcome. And I think there's a lot of environmental factors that are going in the right direction right now that will be supportive of your initiatives.
Absolutely. I see actually one good question here that maybe we have in the last couple of minutes you can address. It says, how would you create a strategic business case in making DEI separate from HR? What are some examples of successful initiatives that you can do as a global organization to promote DEI globally?
So by being separate, you mean, I think one immediate argument is where it reports into. And you're seeing a lot of companies, I think IBM just did this, they're creating a very senior position reporting to the CEO, which I think gives it a lot of visibility and ideally a lot of power. I think there's an argument for that. I also think if you have a really strong CHRO that can integrate all the DE&I activities into the core human capital strategy, that's also a compelling way to approach it. So I think it really comes down to what's going to be most effective in your organization to execute the strategy. And that usually has a lot to do with power in the organization, where the power resides.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that too, Joe. One thing I would add is that, it's always good at some point in the journey to create a separate function, very related but separate function. I kind of think about it like quality and manufacturing. And, it used to be quality was part of manufacturing. I'm an engineer, so this is the kind of example I have from my past. And then, at a certain time, the quality function becomes its own function and reports sometimes directly to the CEO. But I will say this, I would not advise that that's the first thing you do, right? I think the first thing you do is you want to still, under the leadership of HR, and I say this, of course, there's exceptions, but broadly, if you're considering it, consider, again, doing it a little bit at a time. First, do some investigation, look at it under HR, do an assessment, see what you really want to do. You can do all of that. And then at some point, you'll know when it's the right time to have that separate function and the kind of visibility and direct reporting relationship to the president or CEO. With that, we're out of time. We could talk about this a lot longer. It's been such a pleasure. Joe, thank you so much for joining us and taking time for your busy day. I look forward to talking to you soon again. And thank you, everyone. Please stay in touch. Webinar at ouroffice.io. We look forward to it. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sonia.